So today we're going to talk about a project that I've been working on that's been taking a lot of my time and is why I haven't put out as many other episodes as I was planning to. It's just the plot keeps getting thicker. Hi, my name is Jen, and this is Outcasts and Dissidents, New England's History of Misbehavior, where we talk about true crime, real renegades, and rebellious countercultures of New England's past. So I figured I would just do an episode and talk about what I've been working on that's been taking all my time. And anyone who knows me is going to be like, oh God, she's talking about this again, some more. And they've probably already heard a lot of it, but I wanted to do a whole thing and just go through, kind of like from beginning to end what I've been working on, what I've learned. And so I guess I'll start off by just kind of laying out how I came across this project, which was kind of cool. So I work with a local historical society, and our grant writers were working on a grant application, and they wanted to discuss, I should say that we have a jail, an old Victorian jail. That's our museum. And so the grant writers were working on telling some stories about marginalized people who had been incarcerated at one time or another in the jail. And they came across the 1930 census, and they had recently heard me say that back in 1890, there were, almost 100 Black people living in our county. And then by 1930, there was less than half a dozen. It was like 3 or 4. And so when they found a Black person incarcerated in 1930, they were like, well, that's really disproportionate. And they sent me the census. And so I just go over to newspapers.com and I Google the guy's name. They had his name listed as Lorin Roberts. And I came up with like dozens of newspaper articles, and they were wild. And I was like, okay, so this is a whole story. And it's been over a year now, and I'm still doing research and learning about the family and learning about him. Even just spelling his name differently has brought up all kinds of different results for me. And so I guess that's a good foundation, right? So it turns out that his family, his father's side is unknown. He was born out of wedlock. His mom didn't get married until 1906. He was born in 1902. There were like 4 siblings that were before she was married. And they're usually listed as mulatto, whereas the other siblings, the stepdad was definitely Black. And so some of these kids are listed as mulatto, and some of them are listed as Negro or Black or whatever. So looking back through his mom's side, I found that her lineage goes back in Washington County, Maine, to around the time of the American Revolution, for sure. We have the first descendant shows up in the 1790 census, the very first census. And there was a community outside of Machias that was started by a freed slave, London Addis, and that's Addisville. His family may have lived there. I'm not sure, because in that census, the 1790 census, it just says township west of Machias or whatever, which sounds roughly like where Addisville may have been. So I'm not totally sure. It might be another town too, because Washington County and Hancock County, where he also lived later, neither of those were really founded until after the war of, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. When the British won those, then this area, which was the territory of the Abenaki and the French, ended up becoming British. So we were actually like New England for like 15 years or whatever before the Revolution. And the question, I guess, is that we really don't have any answer to is, how did the family even end up here? Because his, whoever this is, like, great-great-great-great-grandfather, there's no record of how he came here. There are some Roberts, white people. Was he with them? Were there not? I mean, Roberts is a fairly common name. It's not that distinctive. So I guess could be slave, could be servant, could have been a pirate for all we know, could have been an escapee, fugitive, refugee of some sort. it's really hard to say. As I in the pirate episode, pirates did love Washington County. It's a fairly remote place. If people wanted to get away for any reason, not just because they were a pirate or whatever, but for any reason, or if they just stood away on a ship and went, oh, this is a nice place, and then winter hit and they realized it wasn't, but they were stuck. So it's hard to say how they actually ended up here. I talked to my friend Vanna Carmona down in Portland, and she has been working for the last decade plus on listing all of the enslaved people she could find, all of the enslavers she could find from Maine up until about 1800, and the name doesn't come up. So that doesn't mean that, you know, he wasn't on that list. It just means that we can't prove it. So we really don't know, and I wouldn't want to say that he was a slave necessarily when he very well may not have been. So going on from there, you go forward a couple of generations, and this one family was a significant part of Addison, Maine's population. So even back then and today, the population hasn't changed that much. There's like 500 or 600 people. And today, sticking with Maine's usually like very, very white population, Addison's population is, 0.5% black these days. There's like 3, but it was actually 3.5% of the population was in 2 households, and this was all the Roberts family. So they were a fairly substantial part of this community's population. Cousins ended up marrying cousins because you had anti-miscegenation laws, or even just the social construct of you shouldn't intermarry. And then, it's a small gene pool. Like, even the white people were pretty incestuous in Washington and Hancock County. Maybe they still are. I don't know. Because, like I said, the populations really are still very small, even today. So, of course, his great-grandmother... Was it his grandmother? It happened a couple of times, actually, where he had cousins marrying cousins. And then, we don't actually know who his father was. I know who he says his father was, and I'm not about to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But he did have theories about that, and photos make it kind of convincing. I'm not totally convinced I want to open that can of worms, but his mom was a laundress, and his grandmother as well. And so when you have people who do a service like that, that would likely be a service that's targeted at the wealthy. The average person or someone who has less money isn't going to be a target for that type of service. So I would hazard the guess that might be true. And it's also a very common name in that area. But the stepdad who the mother married in 1906 was the son of the Second Great Awakening prophet, Reverend William E. Foy. Now, there's a lot going on with this. I keep reading things that are a little bit confused as to this whole out of wedlock thing. No, Orin was not the father of the baker's dozen. The mother had a baker's dozen with 13 children, of which Lorin was one of them, one of the oldest. But Orin, he was actually emancipated by his father when he was 16, but his father was a traveling prophet, and he started a couple of churches, one down on Mount Desert Island, and he ended up settling in Sullivan, Maine, in Hancock County, and he bought a little bit of land, bought a little bit more land. People thought that he died, but he didn't actually. When the Second Great Awakening didn't happen, or the Second Coming of Christ didn't occur the way that he had prophesied, he didn't die. He just came up to Maine, and he had passed the baton on to one of his proteges or whatever. It was actually a white woman. So the really interesting thing, Orin actually, according to a book that I read recently, they think that he was actually running the lobster pound on Dyer Island. So this family, mostly, they moved around a little bit, but they mostly lived on Dyer Island, which is technically part of Harrington, Maine, but it's more accessible over the water from Millbridge. And this is really interesting. And the story, again, as interesting as the story is about the guy we found in the jail, the whole thing is really interesting with his family because it brings up a lot of the historical points as to what it was like to actually be Black in Maine for a lot of reasons over a period of time. So, like I said, they had the small community where his family was 2 households that were very close together. And then, there's like the township or whatever, like they lived in Addisville, which was a Black community. But there was kind of forms of segregation. Like instead of, these areas are very rural. So instead of having ghettos, everybody's fairly separated. So what they would do is they would send Black families to live on islands or in swamps so that they were in less desirable locations and away from the community, but still able to contribute work basically to the economy of the main community without having to be like an actual presence. So they lived on Dyer Island, and even on Dyer Island, I was surprised to find out how many people were actually living on Dyer Island and that there was a community there up on the northern part. There was a school even with a teacher who had one arm, which is kind of a fun fact. It was only for a few years, but it was in fact during the time that Lorin would have been living on that island and would have been of age to go to that school. But then there was also times where they didn't have enough of a population, and so the kids would go to school on the mainland in Millbridge. So the dad, Orin, stepdad, was running this lobster pound, which for people who don't know is like where they kind of keep lobsters in the ocean but close to shore, like in a almost like a little wildlife sanctuary or refuge or something. But they just kind of raise them there. And that was actually on the southwest cove. And so the rest of the community was on the north part of the island. So even though they were segregated to this island, they were also segregated from the community on this island. And there was also a time that they lived on Frenchboro, which is actually in Hancock County. But it's a good ways out. It's like 6 miles or something from the mainland. It's actually really far out there. And that is where one of his sisters was born. Her name was Blanche. And so Blanche's story kind of kicks off this adverse experience phase that happened to him in his late teens that I think really set a bad tone for his adulthood. So Blanche was born on Frenchboro in 1917 or 1916. And they ended up moving back to Dyer Island. Now, there was a time where a lot of Dyer Island had changed hands of ownership during that time. And so I think that it was actually when they moved back to the island before Blanche died that Orin took over the lobster pound, maybe. I'm not sure. Documentation's terrible. And even talking to people in Washington County, they're like, I don't know. So they moved. She was born in Frenchboro. They moved back. She was about 1.5 years old, and she got sick. And so Lorin, as I believe he was the oldest son at that time, was sent to shore in Millbridge, probably a paddle boat because it was a long time ago. So he probably had, get in a dory or whatever and paddle over to Millbridge to find the doctor. He couldn't find the doctor. The doctor was out on a call. And I don't know how long he was gone. He might have been gone for a couple of hours or something. I don't know. But when he got back to the island, they were upset with him because he didn't bring the doctor back. But the doctor wasn't around. He couldn't find him. So they put Blanche on the boat, and he goes to take her to shore, and she died on the boat while he was paddling her back to shore. And so they blamed him. And he was only 16. So he was just basically a kid. And he was blamed for the death of a sibling. And I think, so my understanding from family was that he didn't like to talk about the family that hurt him. So there's something he really didn't like to talk about, but that we know about from death records, documentary evidence, and the things that he more or less said to family about not wanting to talk about it. So go forward a few years, and it's 1920, and his mom was like in her 50s, and even Orin was actually in his 70s at this point. But the mom was delivering another baby. His name was George, and it went wrong, and she split open and started bleeding everywhere, hemorrhaging, and both her and George died in delivery. He might have been a breech birth, umbilical cord around the neck, probably type thing, if I had to guess. And so they both died. And it says that they died in Millbridge, which makes me think that probably, again, they were taken on a boat into town to find the doctor, and they died there. because otherwise I think it would say that they died either on Dyer Island or in Harrington, is my understanding of, the patterns that I've seen in these papers. So, yeah, they both died. And I'm sure because of that experience with Blanche previously, where he was so strongly blamed for that he probably shouldered more of the burden for their deaths. Like there was something that he could have done to prevent them, which, I mean, not really. Like this was a really common thing back then, but also, I mean, this is kind of speculation on my part, but that's just based on my understanding of him not wanting to talk about the family and that type of thing. I think this is what happened. And he also later named his son George, by the way. But 5 days later, Orin died. And it turns out that Orin had chronic interstitial nephritis, kidney disease. And so he died from that, they say, just 5 days later. So that's like 3 deaths in a week. And which is a lot even for then, especially like, I mean, he had a couple of other siblings die. There was a 5-month-old that died from cholera. I think it was like 1915. So it's not that they weren't familiar with the death of children or anything, but it's both of his parents and his sibling all died at one time. And I'm sure witnessing the death with the delivery would have been absolutely horrific. It's never great when people bleed to death. So I think that was probably really traumatic for everyone involved. And then later that same year, his closest brother, Donis, died. Both of them in the 1920 census show up as being teamsters, and Dyer Island was actually commonly harvested for lumber. It was clear cut over and over again by these paper companies and logging companies. Later, after this family left, it was always like Polish lumbermen that lived there. So he basically would have lost, like half of his family in the year of 1920. Some of the kids went on to live with their grandmother in the swamp in Millbridge. She lived to be actually like 95. She lived from the 1840s and 1940s. And, she must have been a badass. And so a lot of the kids, like I said, they had a total of 13 kids. So, there was, I think 9 of them were around by this time. And so some of them, it looks like, actually went to school in Bangor, a couple of the boys. Some of the other kids stayed with the grandmother. Some of the kids even stayed with the grandmother like their whole lives. They never moved out and got married or anything like that. They just stayed with the house. And so even all of his life, he would go back and he would visit her in Millbridge. All these times where he desperately needed somewhere to go, he would a lot of times end up back around grandma's house. He also had enlisted in the draft for World War I. And from what I had read about him later on, I was totally convinced he was like a battle-hardened veteran and had been through all of this stuff. But that wasn't what happened at all. It turned out that he actually had enlisted for the draft, but was never sent to war. And I don't even think that like any Black men served in World War I from Maine at all, as far as I could tell. I found a book and it was like all the, it was like, enlisted for service, white. And it went through pages and pages and pages and pages of people who had been enlisted. And I was like, is that a reference to race? And then I get to the end of it and it's like enlisted for service Black, and there's just nothing. And so I don't know what happened there, but I'm pretty sure there were actually no Black men in World War I from Maine. So, and at that time it said when he enlisted for the draft, it said that he was working at a sardine factory in Southwest Harbor on Mount Desert Island in Hancock County. And so that place it's called Addison's, or was called Addison's, and it was a place that people a lot of times from Washington County would actually come to work in the summer and make a lot of money. I mean, they actually made really good money, even though they worked a gazillion hours, and it was like nonstop, and it was horrible work. Like, just imagine packing sardines, like disgusting. And I actually talked to old people who did this, and they said that, they would have cats wandering around and like picking the fish up off the floor and stuff. Like, yeah, not super fun, just slimy and smelly and hot and gross. But that was what he did, and people did make good money at it. So, yeah, then he went on to be a teamster, which was a much better call. So, yeah, that was basically his early life, where people all around him just kind of started dropping like flies. And I think it set him up in a bad way for his future. And then it was just a couple of years later that you start seeing him getting in trouble. But even though 1923 is kind of where you start seeing like this little bit more exciting story, you're gonna have to wait because I'm trying to keep these like 20 or 30 minutes and it is a long story. So just it goes crazy, you guys. So before things totally go off the rails, I'm gonna call it for this episode, and I plan to put out new episodes about this pretty much back to back because for the most part I have so many citations and I've done so much research and I've written about this several times over, and I will continue to be writing about it, so I can really crank these out. The research is done. The script is basically in my head because, like I said, I talk about this all of the time and I've written it over and over again. Right now, I am working on an entry for Lorin for the African American National Biography, which is a joint project between Oxford Publishing and Harvard University. And so he will have a 1,000-word entry in their biography, which has like 4,000 biographies. If you want to buy it, a copy is $1,400, not lying. But it's a huge project. It's really cool. And I'm super excited because there was already an entry for his step-grandfather, Reverend William E. Foy, is already in there. And there's actually some stuff that I could add or suggest some changes to that entry because of things that I know from my research that I think would be really beneficial. And I don't know if they'll agree with me or not, but I'm going to talk to somebody. So stay tuned, check in again, and we will have more episodes as things go. Totally crazy, not just for Lorin, but it really shows a bigger picture of what it was like to be Black in Maine during the KKK's kind of takeover in Maine during the 1920s and 1930s, and also like the things that happened to him and the way that they played out went on to affect other Black folks in Maine during that time. Like people ended up being targeted and stuff just because of him, inadvertently, obviously not because he wanted that, but just because that was what happened. And so we'll get into all that, and I'll try to show some bigger picture context as to exactly how and why these things went the way that they did. So that's it for this episode, and I will talk to you guys again soon. So follow on Patreon too, because if you follow on Patreon as a paid member, then that helps to fund me doing all this research because I literally already quit my job for this. And also, you will get some sneak exclusive stuff. I will post some of my resources up there and stuff for my followers to check out. So if you'd like to see that, jump on over there and join. Thank you. Until next time, I'll be wishing you fair winds, following seas, and, what are we going to do this time? Equity? Let's do equity.